A lot of nonsense today.
No problem. I'm happy to repeat myself because I'm still very pleased to welcome you all to the seminar series. I'm still very grateful for Kemi and Yun for doing the work to organize the seminar series, which is of benefit to us all. And I'm still very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Professor Kate Jensen from Williams College in the US. Kate has a first degree in physics and a PhD in physics from Princeton and from Harvard. She's done postdoctoral work at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, at Yale, and at ETH Zurich, and has now been, I think, for 4 years in Williams?
Yeah, 4.5.
4.5 years at Williams College, and will tell us something about work over the last couple of years on elastic capillary adhesion. And with that, I gladly hand over to you.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and I'm sorry to be, I think, a disembodied voice at the moment, but I want to very much encourage folks to ask questions and interrupt, and if that's possible in this format, or wait till the end and we can have some more sort of face-to-face conversation. So so thanks for the introduction. I'm very pleased to tell you about the work that I and my group have been doing in the last few years on elastic capillary adhesion. And in particular, I want to kind of start by talking about kind of what I mean by both the capillary and the elastic parts of this, as well as and the adhesion, and particularly because I understand this may be a very broad audience, and so I kind of want to give you all a kind of a sort of an introduction to these ideas, and that really motivate the work that we've been doing. So here we go. So I wanted to basically start, before I get into telling you about what these beautiful little blobs are here on my screen, I want to tell you a bit about both the wetting and the wetting and adhesion, and give you start with a brief primer on wetting and adhesion. And I picked this particular background picture here because for me it's a beautiful example of wetting in action. This was a picture that I took across the street from my apartment a couple of years ago, and just really love these beautiful water droplets that are wetting this rose. And so to start with the wetting part of this, we want to think about surface tension and fluid mechanics. And so the idea of surface tension is hopefully one that's familiar to all of you. And it's this idea that for liquids, their mechanics, especially on small scales where they're not so big that the gravity and other effects start to matter, that their surface tension dominates their mechanics. And so you can define a surface energy or a surface tension, which is the energetic cost per unit area to create new surface. And that's indeed what makes bubbles round and droplets round, and governs how sort of the shapes of these droplets. And you can quantify this a little bit more by saying, well, there's a free energy change or free energy cost to changing shape given by the free energy per area of the surface times the change in the area. So if you, for example, with a liquid droplet were to deform the shape, you necessarily perhaps stretch or increase the area, and you get then a change in the overall energy. So that's basically why small water droplets are round in our experience. And then really interesting things start happening when you start allowing a liquid to interact with surfaces. And so anytime when you have a surface, now there's additional surface interactions, each of which has a surface energy. So if I imagine my liquid droplet and approaching a surface and now wetting onto a surface, there's now not just this surface energy of the liquid itself, but also the surface energy of the dry surface, the surface energy of the wet surface, in order to understand how something gets wet, we need to think about what happens at really where all of these things meet at this contact line right here. So zooming in here with the most dramatic and exciting PowerPoint effect I think I've ever used, we can really examine what's going on in a theoretical way and say, well, if this contact line is stable, the forces have to balance at the contact line. And so the wet surface energy, the dry surface tension, and the liquid surface tension need to balance. And what that does is it allows us to use the balance of the energies to determine a contact angle, such that you form a static contact angle for a given balance of energies. And so that's where the famous Young-Dupre law of wetting comes from. It's a simple force balance or an energy balance at this contact line. And this doesn't just have to be about water droplets on flat surfaces. This is quite important also in the reverse situation where maybe you have particles on a liquid surface. And so you may be familiar with particle adsorption. It's if you have somewhat hydrophobic particles, they tend to sit at air-water interfaces. And this is very important in a lot of both biological and sort of non-biological processes as well. It's very common in nature. And in these sort of situations, if you have again, sort of an ideal spherical solid particle now, it's a balance of surface tensions at this interface that will set a that same constant contact angle. But now what that's doing is it's pinning the particles to the interface at sort of a particular position relative to their size. So this is equivalent to saying that the proportionality of how deep something goes to its size is linearly related. They're directly proportional to each other. So no matter what size, it's not too high, it's not too low. It kind of sits just right in a place determined by that balance of surface energies. Okay, so that's the idea with sort of wetting and capillary forces. And there you can have, of course, much more complicated capillary forces in a lot of contexts. And this is something, as I mentioned, that comes up in nature quite a lot. And so, for example, there are insects that actually take advantage of these capillary forces to propel themselves along water surfaces and up menisci. They're really remarkable bugs, and by sort of doing this back bend, they change their curvature, and so they change then what their essentially contact angle is with the fluid, and they're pushed up sort of to the edge of water. Some of the work in my group, which I'd be delighted to talk to people about in questions, but is not sort of the main topic for today, involves looking at these multicellular propagules of the liverwort plant. This is how this plant reproduces asexually, and we see that these propagules adsorb very strongly to air-water interfaces and can arrange themselves perhaps for optimal propagation. That's the hypothesis we're studying in this particular project. And of course, much more locally, right here in this department, there's beautiful work looking at how insects use these kind of capillary interactions and forces in order to adhere and walk on surfaces. So stealing this directly from my fine host, but it's a beautiful example again of capillary forces in nature. Right. So that last example starts to get into looking at how capillarity can help you adhere and stick. But it's not just sort of liquid things that stick. So I want to actually then do for the second half of my sort of quick introduction to capillarity and adhesion, to think about adhesion, in particular, how you might get into a sticky situation. Any of you who know me know I'm a big fan of sticky notes, so I always have them around. So how do you get into a sticky situation? Well, that comes down to surface energies again, but from a little bit of a different perspective. So step one is you should have surface energies that favor creating an interface. So now I'm not saying whether I have some material 1, material 2, I'm not saying whether they're a solid or a liquid or whatever. I'm just saying that they have some surface energy, creatively labeled gamma 1 and gamma 2, of surface energies with respect to what air or vacuum or whatever this black sort of void may be. And then I think consider the possibility of bringing them together. And so, and basically the question of whether or not they want to stick or they have an adhesion between them is really asking the question of, if I create this interface with some new surface interfacial energy, gamma 1, 2, does that overall lower my free energy per area to create this interface versus preserving the original two free interfaces? And so you can define linearly a linear combination, that's the adhesion energy per area. That's a simple linear combination of these. And very similar to the wetting we saw earlier, there's a free energy change now not so much on changing the shape, but now on eliminating or creating free surface. So there's a free energy change on sticking equal to minus W times the area of contact. So that area that you create between here. If W is positive, you lower your energy by creating this interface and you want to stick. The trouble is that in real life, most surfaces are not perfectly flat. I think physicists always like to draw perfectly flat shapes. We also like to draw spheres. So that's a good example of a shape that is not actually perfectly flat. So in order to actually stick, you have to be able to actually create this contact area. And so when your surfaces are not both perfectly flat, when you bring them together, you might or might not actually be able to do that. And so this is where having deformable materials becomes important. So if, for example, material 2 can be deformed because maybe it's a liquid, or maybe because it's a soft solid, like the sorts that I work with in my lab quite a lot, and also that are very common in a lot of natural systems, then that can deform to create energy. or create surface and thereby lower the total energy. And as we saw with the wetting example, for liquids, only the surface energy balance actually matters in determining the geometry and the sort of depth at which the number one will indent number two. In fact, for a pure liquid, this reduces to the adsorption example I showed you before of the particles on a liquid interface. But when this is a solid or something more solid like, that deformation to create this extra interface also costs additional energy. So the stiffness, the Young modulus of the material, the Poisson ratio, in general, the elastic properties also provide a resistance to deformation that that becomes important in determining whether or not you can create contact area in the first place, and ultimately how much you can create. And so the classic theories of adhesion, even though adhesion and wetting are very similar in a lot of ways, the classic theories of adhesion really focused on this question of what is this competition between adhesion energy trying to driving a system to create as much contact area as possible versus elasticity resisting that deformation. And one of the key results of this classic theory by Johnson, Kendall, and Roberts was that in the example of a zero load, which is to say you just take a sphere and say set it on the surface, like our adsorption example, there's a prediction for spontaneous indentation that the indentation depth, how far down you go, should be proportional to material properties, the adhesion energy, the elasticity, the Poisson ratio, but most importantly should scale as the radius of the particle to the 1/3 power. So this has all been sort of mostly conceptual so far, but this is a testable hypothesis with soft materials, and that's one that I and actually starting with my colleague Rob Stile have had a chance to test. So we did experiments putting small sort of tens of micrometers scale particles on very soft and less soft and more soft substrates. And I said this was started by Rob Stile in his earlier work, and then I picked it up later. And we can plot basically sort of the indentation depth versus particle radius. There's a rescaling here to collapse experiments with different material properties together. But just to sort of introduce you to this idea, so up here on the right, we have larger and stiffer spheres. The red is the higher modulus, the down to blue is a very, this is about I think the key disappeared, but this is about a 500 kilopascal modulus samples down to about 3 kilopascal modulus samples, so about 2 orders of magnitude in stiffness. And what we see is for the larger and stiffer spheres, you do get this scaling that JKR predicts, that the indentation depth, the spontaneous indentation depth, scales as r to the 1/3 power. But as you approach really soft but still solid materials, we see actually we recover the capillary wetting adsorption-like behavior where the indentation depth is directly proportional to the radius. And so what's plotted through here is the theory derived by Rob Stile, which is basically an energetic approach that combines writes a total energy as being the adhesion energy, the elastic energy, the adhesion energy driving you to make contact area, the elastic resistance to that, but then also a capillary resistance to that from having to create the extra contact area here. And what Rob saw is that really captures this transition from elastic to capillary behavior. And this is a really, for me, was a really interesting example of this sort of the nature of very soft, solid materials, where you have the situation where you have solids that start to act like liquids that can't flow. And you get this competition between elastic and capillary behavior on soft solids on small length scales, which has sort of motivated a lot of the work that I've been working on in the last few years. And I'll just note that the adhesion versus elastic parts, if you only consider this, that you exactly recover the classic adhesion theory, but by adding in the capillary part, you're able to capture a much broader range of behavior of these very, very soft solids. Okay, so then with the, sort of starting from here, the work that, I just wanted to note there's a crossover around an elastic capillary length scale which is just given by the ratio of the surface stress or surface tension to the elastic modulus. So that starts to tell you where the crossover in behavior from elastically dominated solid to sort of traditional solid to capillary dominated, sort of more liquid-like but still solid behavior occurs. Okay, so from there, just to give you a little bit more background coming into the main story I want to tell you about today, I did a whole bunch of more work looking at these sorts of things. So really zooming in when you have a particle sitting on a gel or a soft gel material. So there's an additional complication, a lot of very, very compliant materials are gels, including the sort of PDMS and silicone workhorses of a lot of soft matter, hydrogels. The sorts of biophysical gels that we're made out of are also very, very soft materials that also have a significant fluid component. And it turns out that in an adhesive context, a spherical particle in contact with the gel can cause the fluid phase of the gel to phase separate and come out of the gel. And what this leads to, essentially what this does is it allows the gel to make more of that contact area, but without the solid part of the gel having to really make a very extreme sort of shape and cusp here. The liquid can do that with no elastic penalty because it's a liquid. And then what you end up with is you get instead of having a single contact line, you have 3 contact lines. And this quite complicated sort of diagram of classic Young-Dupre wetting balance and a soft solid liquid vapor and a rigid solid soft solid liquid. So all of these different contact zones and contact lines, each of which are governed by a balance of surface energies and surface tensions there. And that's something that my group has been looking into more recently with direct imaging. And this is and so by dyeing the gel on the fluid phase, you can start to really examine what's going on in this phase separated fluid region and directly examine. So these are results from confocal microscopy with markers on the solid surface and a dyed fluid phase that you can see gets pulled up into this contact zone. So even something as simple as putting a sphere on a soft surface turns out to be actually quite complicated in terms of what's going on there. And you have this fluid and soft solid sort of mediated contact, which I think is really very interesting. It's something we're looking into further. So all of these different projects all had a lot of physics in them, but always sort of had the same basic geometry of a rigid sphere on some kind of a deformable substrate, whether that be a liquid or a solid. And one of the questions I often got asked when I was presenting the earlier work was, well, why don't you invert the problem and maybe put a soft sphere on a rigid substrate? And there's a lot of reasons why this might be interesting. And at first I thought, oh, well, it's going to be the same and you're just turning it upside down. But actually, you can have potentially a larger range of deformations. There's potentially some different sort of geometries that are achievable. And also, practically speaking, a lot of commercial adhesives as well as sort of natural systems are actually built more like this, where you're bringing a soft object in contact with some kind of a substrate. And I mentioned earlier, I really like sticky notes. I don't know if you've ever looked at the back of a sticky note or really looked at the back of a sticky note. But here is a 3M Post-it on that we took a picture of with the SEM, and you see the sort of cellulose fibers of the paper. But most importantly, you see these round sort of spherical asperities, which is actually the adhesive itself. So a lot of commercial adhesives are deliberately bumpy or rough on the back, partly to help make contact with sort of uneven surfaces, make contact with uneven surfaces. And you see these sort of really quite a large range. It's 100 micrometer scale bar here. And so practically speaking, a lot of things make contact in this way by bringing something soft into contact with something else. So we wanted to look into this a bit more. And I'd be remiss in talking about sort of these experiments without mentioning a couple of recent studies looking at adhesion of compliant spheres with rigid substrates. One was a theory paper by Tom Salas et al. That was actually a cover of Soft Matter, which was a purely elastocapillary theory, very much like the style theory for rigid spheres on soft substrates. But this one, flipping it around, now putting this compliant spheres on flat rigid substrates. And this incorporates adhesion, elasticity, and the solid surface tension to make predictions for how these things will adhere as a function of their material properties. And importantly, it assumes a perfectly spherical cap geometry so that they always will look like this. Even more recently, there was an experimental study by Aditi Chakrabarty and Manoj Chaudhuri looking at hydrogel spheres of pretty large length scale and quite low modulus, where they, and over a bit of a limited range of these stiffnesses, but where they always saw actually not a spherical cap profile as Salas had predicted, but rather they always saw sort of a spherical cap with these feet, as they described it, and thought about the feet as a entirely elastic extension of the sphere. And so with that in mind, and also with all of our previous work looking at elastocapillary adhesion and thinking about also phase separation adhesion, we set out to do some experiments to see what would happen if we made very soft gel spheres and adhered them to things. And so this is how we make them. So they're polydimethylsiloxane gels. We make them, so we take a divinyl terminated linear PDMS. I'm giving the Gelest order number in case you want to run and make some yourself. And we combine that with a chemical crosslinker that's a copolymer of PDMS and this other monomer that has a hydro group that can attack the vinyl groups on the PDMS, as well as a catalyst. We mix that together to a somewhat viscous liquid, and since it's oil-based, we can basically make our microspheres by a process that I like to call enthusiastic vortexing, whereby we basically we put sort of several drops of the silicone premix and just vortex the heck out of it in order to emulsify these silicone oil droplets into the water, and then we allow them to cure before they coalesce. Or they don't have time to coalesce. So we get sort of thousands and thousands of very highly polydisperse spheres in a water bath. We also always set aside a bulk sample for stiffness measurement so that we can have a way to measure the elastic properties of the spheres as well. And so once we do that, just to give you a sense of what that looks like, here's my student when he finally got this preparation working, and you can see the fluid looks kind of cloudy because of all of the spheres in it, because the index of refraction is a little bit different from water. So that's kind of what it looks like practically. Okay, and so then starting to take a closer look, because PDMS is a little bit less dense than water, these things will cream over time. And so if you take out a few mils of this sort of dispersion and allow the particles to cream for quite a while, they start to aggregate and make these beautiful fractal aggregates at the air-water interface. And in this case, what I've done is I've just taken a microscope slide and tapped it down onto the surface to pick them up, and so I could take a look in bright field at these spheres. And you can see there's the scale bar, and there's sort of spheres of a lot of different sizes. And I'm also really interested in these kind of aggregate structures, and I wanted, particularly to a bioengineering audience, wanted to sort of mention that we see faceting between them. We see kind of sort of things that start to look a little bit like a dense tissue, maybe visually. And I'm really curious if there might be some interesting applications of these studying something that's in between a foam to an emulsion, and maybe perhaps has some similarities to biological tissues, although that's a bit out of my field of expertise. So I put that out there in case you guys have great ideas, and then let's work together and do that and do something with it. Meanwhile, for the purposes of this study, we characterize these spheres. We can look at them in the confocal microscope also. So here's a trio of spheres that sort of stuck to each other, and we can do the same tricks as we were doing with the sort of slab PDMS geometry. We can put a fluorescent dye inside of the spheres. We can put small fluorescent particles on the outside. There's some that also stuck to the glass surface around here. And what that allows us to see is we can see that these spheres merged after they got the little particles on their surface. We can see some of their original outlines. We can see how they facet to each other. And importantly for this study, we can also see that, like their bulk counterparts, they phase separate in adhesive contact. So you can see that the dyed fluid does extend out past the original edges of the sphere. So we see that behavior with these guys as well, that the fluid is mobile. Right. Okay. So now that I've told you something about the spheres and how we make them, I want to show you our sort of the results of our adhesion study. So here's the pictures we started the talk with. Now that you have in your minds the same sort of the elasticity and capillarity and adhesion ideas, let's put that all together to think about how these spheres adhere to glass or adhere to something as simple as flat glass. So what we see immediately is that stiffer, so these range from stiffer to softer or more compliant. Stiffer spheres you see immediately deform very little in adhesive contact. There's just sort of a little bit of a facet here and a little bit of a sort of that foot. We see as they get softer, they deform more. Oops, sorry, they deform more, and you can see more and sort of more prominently that the sort of foot or meniscus regime. And even when they deform quite a lot, this is a long way from its original spherical shape. The center region always takes the form of a spherical cap, but then with these meniscus or feet to bridge into the contact zone. Okay, so there's some sort of key qualitative observations, and now we want to start to quantify this. So we redesigned the experiment. So this is on these make really pretty pictures, but what we really want to be able to do is map the entire profile. So we redesigned the experiment a little to really get clean side view images of the entire profile. And then what we can do is we can take this and do edge mapping to determine basically the complete geometry of a sphere in adhesive contact. So here I have plotted the profile mapped from that image I just showed you. It's colored here by the total curvature of the surface. And that's determined by fitting locally to a surface of constant total curvature. And that takes into account the fact that it's an axisymmetric object. And so we really do know the full 3D shape. Again, because it's axisymmetric, we can do a volume of revolution integral to get the total volume. And from that, we know what its original volume is. So while once it's adhered, the spherical cap shape has this radius R1, we can also note what its original radius was, which is here is R0, as well as things like its height, so the angles it makes, et cetera. So anything you want to know, we can measure it from this. And so right now, what I want to do is really focus on what the simplest thing I can think of to look at, which wasn't actually the first thing we thought of, but eventually you get to the simplest thing, which is just to look at how the adhered height of the spheres varies with the original contact radius. So how is that related? And so here is a graph of that. So here's the height, as I mentioned, versus the original radius of each sphere. And what you see for this now sort of about 277, I think, individual sphere experiments over a range of stiffnesses, almost to 5 orders of magnitude. You see immediately that there is a sort of a scaling dependence of the height grows with the radius, which sort of makes some sense. And also that as you go from softer to stiffer spheres, there's a sort of a steeper dependence of that. And also this geometric upper bound that you're seeing here is really just geometry. So the spheres are bounded at the top here by a line of h equals 2 r naught, which is just basically to say that since the spheres can't hover above the surface, they can never be taller than twice their radius or their diameter. So that sets a geometric upper bound. But we also noticed a sort of an empirical lower bound here, which fitting to this empirical lower bound, that corresponds to a very flattened but still sort of finite spherical cap. And if you like thinking about things in terms of contact angles, and hopefully you do after the brief primer on wetting, if you didn't before, then this would correspond to a 180-degree Young-Dupré contact angle, sort of a totally phobic kind of a surface. And this corresponds to about an 18-degree wetting angle. So just to give you a sense of that. Now, next to what we want to do is try to sort of scale the data so that we can think about things in a more coherent way. And so since we see this, we see these lines, what we want to do is we're going to rescale the data from the height by the radius to a shape factor equal to h divided by twice the radius. And so that means now our 180-degree geometric limit is just at a value of 1. And I also rescaled here the horizontal axis by the Young modulus. And so what that does is we see that collapses the data rather well onto a sort of an overall curve that transitions from being sort of the larger and stiffer spheres being up at this sort of undeformed sphere limit, or approaching this undeformed sphere limit, and then heading down and then really leveling out. So this really highlights the fact that it's an entire order of magnitude or so of modulus that really just sort of levels out and has the same contact angle or the same sort of spherical geometry even as the spheres continue to get softer and softer. All right, so next we want to try to understand where this is coming from. And since, as I mentioned, we all love we love sort of classic elastic adhesion. Let's try that first. And so if I take the theory, one thing first, just to give you a sense of what this looks like, this was where about 90-degree contact angle would be our hemisphere. And to really give you a sense, then here's what some actual example pictures of spheres at these different amounts of deformation look like. Okay, so now we want to try to explain it. And if I take sort of that classic Johnson-Kendall-Roberts adhesion versus elasticity theory and try to make a prediction for how the shape factor should scale with this parameter, what I get is a pretty good prediction for the stiffest spheres, where we would expect elasticity to dominate the resistance to deformation, but that really fails to describe the more compliant spheres. On the other hand, since we've seen that these materials can behave in elastocapillary ways, particularly as you go to smaller length scales and more compliant surfaces, we might think about a purely capillary solution for the softest spheres. And actually, that's exactly what they look like. So as I mentioned before, what a pure liquid establishes constant contact angles, which is equivalent to saying you have a constant shape factor. And so this empirical horizontal line here is completely consistent with a Young-Dupre wetting kind of a model. Excuse me. And so kind of thinking about putting this together, the Tom Sala's elastocapillary theory that I mentioned before did exactly this with an energy balance. And he said basically, well, even though, so what we want to do now is try to put these together theoretically, and starting with the Tom Sala's elastocapillary theory, which isn't the right geometry, but maybe captures some of the key ideas. And just to sort of summarize that theory briefly, what he says is, though, there must be a total energy that's equal to an adhesion component that's related to the area of contact you establish here, just as in the classic Johnson-Kendall-Roberts adhesion theory, versus an elastic energy penalty caused from the deformation of the sphere from its original size to now a spherical cap with radius R1. And then also a capillary energetic penalty caused from the increase of the surface area from your original sphere to now this deformed spherical cap shape. Putting that all together, so that you get the Sala's elastocapillary theory. And once again, I'll just note that the adhesion versus elasticity is exactly a JKR prediction. So that was that pink curve we saw before. And adhesion versus capillarity is exactly wetting. And so those pieces are still there. Now, in the interest of time, I want to jump right ahead to a theory that I've been developing with my colleagues Tim Atherton and his now graduated Dr. Matthew Giso at the Tufts Soft Matter Theory Group, who've been collaborating with us on this project. And basically what we wanted to say there was, well, this captures a lot of the key ideas, but it doesn't get the geometry right. So can we build a model that gets the whole thing right? And so the idea there was to then extend that Sala's elastocapillary theory to include the phase separation that we observe at the feet, to observe, to include this explicitly, this sort of solid meniscus that we're observing experimentally and the consequences of that. And so what this now is it includes this adhesion term. Now it's a bit bigger because it has a whole, because with the fluid coming out, you're able to establish a larger area of contact. there's a new compressive elastic penalty that essentially because you need to squeeze out the fluid, the solid has to compress to get that fluid out. And then a similar elastic penalty to the deformation from a sphere to the spherical cap shape, plus a capillary energy of creating all of this extra new surface. So putting all of that together, we can, it's a bit more of a complicated theory to work out, but we can start to compare the different theories with the data in different conditions. And so the nice thing about the extended elastic capillary theory is that, as I mentioned, it captures the key geometric features of the adhered microspheres. And so here you can see, or maybe not really see very well, that in the background, the blue is an example profile, and the orange is a fit with the extended elastic capillary model, which is this sort of a sphere, which is a spherical cap plus these liquid menisci. But that works not only just to capture the shape, but also the first derivative of the shape, as well as the curvature, which is a second derivative of the total shape. So I really feel like we're capturing with some depth the geometry of this adhesion. And then we can also compare it to the our shape factor collapses. And so that's what I have here now. So I've added where I had the JKR and the capillary wetting before, I've now added both the predictions for the Salles elastic capillary theory and our extended elastic capillary theory, which turned out to actually give very, very similar predictions for how the spheres should deform into adhesion based on their material properties. And this isn't a bad thing. What this is telling us is that the Salles elastic capillary theory may not capture the geometry, but it does capture a lot of the overall energy, at least in determining this deformation. It doesn't tell us anything about the foot formation or the phase separation, but it does at least get kind of the big picture. And whereas ours doesn't do any worse in this particular parameter, or better, but it does tell us a bit more about the overall system. One thing that's always been striking here, though, is how much breadth there is in the data. So while these theories capture the overall trend of the data very well, it doesn't seem to be telling us about this breadth. And that basically comes down to the fact that neither of these theories are actually very sensitive to this particular parameter. Or another way of thinking about it, the actual energy minimum is quite broad for here. So if we take a look at and I'll just do this for the Salles theory because it's easier to plot having fewer terms. So here's an example of the actual potential energy or the energy contributions from all of these different pieces. Oops, sorry. All of these different pieces versus the shape factor. And so what you have here is that sort of remember, as the shape factor goes towards 0, you're getting more and more deformed. And so you have then as the sphere gets more deformed, you have this huge win in terms of reduction of total energy because of adhesion, because you're creating a huge amount of contact area. But that's resisted by the deformation penalty of having to deform against the elastic forces and having to deform against the capillary forces. And so overall, the green here is the total energy. And what you see is that although there is a clear minimum, it's really broad. And so the spheres are not very well constrained to be at a particular extent of deformation or shape factor. Another way of looking at this is that you can take two spheres that are basically the same size and stiffness. They're almost identical to start with. One might deform a bit more in adhesive contact, have larger foot areas. Another might deform a bit less. And those are nearly energetically degenerate. What's really interesting to me about this from an applications and a practical perspective is that means that these are both sort of equally energetically happy in these different configurations. So you have some versatility in making adhesive contact. And if you were, say, to put a whole bunch of different spheres of different sizes on the back of a sticky note, what this means is that larger asperities, if you're going against, say, a flat surface, these larger spherical asperities might deform more in adhesive contact, the smaller ones less, but they don't end up competing against each other in terms of making an adhesive contact. They're not pushing back against, but rather they can work together in a synergistic way to establish a uniform adhesive contact over a large area, even against surfaces that are not conformal to the particular pattern of dots that you have. And so this may have real practical relevance in commercial adhesives and other systems that rely on having sort of soft asperities of various kinds to make an adhesive contact. I think that's quite interesting. And so basically, as I'm starting to run a little short on time, and I want to show you just a couple more things from my lab, but to sort of wrap up the main story here is hopefully I gave you guys an introduction for all about sort of wetting and adhesion and the sort of interesting properties of gels in that they can phase separate in adhesive contact. And so you have to think with these elastocapillary adhesion with soft gel materials, there's a lot to think about, both in terms of the fluid and solid components, as well as the solid capillarity in the liquid, as well as the and elasticity of the material. And so really, so what we're seeing is that we see this sort of range of adhesive contact depending on the material properties. We're able to capture that with an elastocapillary, both a sort of a simple elastocapillary model as well as a more complicated elastocapillary model that includes the phase separation. And really what that kind of points to is that there's this dual role for capillarity in soft gel adhesion of both liquid adhesion, liquid mediated adhesion at those phase separated lines, as well as the soft capillarity of the spheres themselves. And so those are the main sort of conclusions of this part of the talk. And I just wanted to take just a minute or two, since this is quite a broad audience, to show you guys a few more of the things that are going on, sort of different things that are going on in my lab. So broadly, my lab focuses on the mechanics of highly deformable interfaces, both sort of solids that act like liquids, not in the sense that they flow, but in the sense that surface tension matters, but also some more projects related to liquid interfaces. And just to sort of show you this in case there's interest in further discussion and questions, here's some of the things we're working on. So what you've been watching on the left here has been a small fluid leak through a 0.4 millimeter hole on a paraffin coated surface. So it's a fairly hydrophobic surface, which started out as a continuous flow back here, sort of a continuous rivulet. This is slowed down 100 times from real time. And eventually that rivulet destabilizes and drips and drips and drips and drips. And eventually you see the second to last and the last drops. One will not stabilize and the other will stabilize. And so some of the things we're looking at are this sort of flow and constrained geometries and the capillarity and wetting in the context of stabilizing a fluid leak, even when there's still a driving pressure to continue the leak. So that's been a fun set of projects to be looking at. I mentioned earlier this interesting sort of plant biophysics whereby these primitive land plants, Marchantia polymorpha liverworts, seem to be harnessing the water surface energy for their reproductive processes. And that's a new set of projects that we're working on now. And we're really interested in trying to understand whether the plants, so that there's these discs of tissue that when rain falls into the cup where they grow, they arrange themselves on the surface. And we're really interested to try to understand whether the plant has evolutionarily engineered itself to arrange the propagules for optimal dispersal. Other more adhesion related stuff in the soft solids, a couple of years ago, we studied the dynamics of adhesive detachment. So this was, so what you just saw very quickly there was the last moments of an adhesive contact and then the very fast recoil of that coming away. Now we're starting to do projects related to sort of expanding on that, looking more at deformation dependent adhesion and self-deformation as you establish an adhesive contact. So this is a top view on a looking at a sphere that has come into contact and seeing where the contact of that sphere is expanded first rapidly at first and then slower and slower. And finally, we have some really new, really curious projects, sort of some pandemic-inspired science looking at Marangoni-driven surface fracture and pattern and spontaneous pattern formation in actually in milk, in sort of natural protein, sort of protein-laden surfaces. So a lot of fun stuff there that I'm happy to talk more about if anyone's interested in either now or for further discussion. So with that, I just want to acknowledge a few of the many students who worked in my group, and particularly those who worked on this project, the tough soft matter theory group with whom we're working on this elastic capillary adhesion model for the soft microspheres, collaborators at Purdue Materials Engineering who have been working with me on some of the material characterization for our projects, and then leave it on here and be happy to take any questions you guys have. Thank you.
Great. I'm not Maria, as I'm sure many of you know. No, sorry. I'm not Maria.
You guys too.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I'm sure there are questions from the audience. So, Andrea has a question.
Yes, hi, Kate. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I hope you can forgive my voice and still understand me.
Yeah, no problem.
I thought it was very interesting how you combined the different aspects of capillary adhesion and JKR, and I couldn't help but wonder that if I understand it correctly, at least JKR considers that adhesion happens in the contact zone, where there are other theories such as DMT, for example, that considers adhesion outside the same contact. And I wasn't quite sure regarding the role of the liquid in your samples in particular. I'm not quite certain I understand whether there always is some part of the polymer that has stayed uncross-linked in liquid, if that only happens for very soft samples, and how does that basically influence where the excess adhesion is happening. And in particular, I'm curious about whether you know where DMT sits on this curve, this very nice curve that you showed between capillary adhesion and JKR.
Yeah, okay. So let me think about that for a minute. And all the pieces of that. No, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, so
no, for sure. This is something that Victor's also watching this talk. We were texting about it because we weren't quite sure when there was liquid and when there wasn't. And so this is definitely a question that we wanted to ask you. So I guess maybe that's easier to answer.
Yeah. So I'll start there. We have looked at the DMT predictions a bit, and I'm afraid I don't have the sort of the numbers and the quantitative bits off the top of my head, but the conclusion has always been that it's not that we're sort of in the wrong, I forget if we're in the wrong length or the wrong modulus scale for DMT, and I'm sorry I can't remember more precisely than that, although maybe we can get there in the conversation. But with respect to the liquid, so the way we make the gels, we don't extract them. So they always have uncross-linked fluid in them, and that's part of what makes them so soft, is because they're not heavily cross-linked. And so consequently, there's always some unbound fluid that's actually, in the total amount of the unbound fluid is somewhat or it does depend on the amount of cross-linking. So the stiffer materials have a bit less. The more cross-linked materials have a bit less free fluid. The less cross-linked materials have a bit more, and that's something actually we're working on some materials development in the lab to try to decouple those aspects, or at least to have different ranges to work in. And so basically, when you have the cleanest picture is probably this one, because it's just easier to do the imaging when the bulk is the fluid, and the bulk is the gel, and the sphere the sphere is the rigid part. And so then you have the fluid coming out here. So yeah, and so then basically it really, in some ways, it simplifies the contact zone, I guess, because you eliminate the elastic singularity, which has always been a problem for JKR and other sort of adhesive theories, because there's not a single sharp contact line, because it allows the solid to adopt a more moderate configuration, but it also complicates it in that there's fluid coming out, and there is. I think you mentioned some questions about when there is fluid and when there's not. There's always probably some fluid. One of the things that came out of some experiments I didn't tell you about, but that involved basically taking the sphere and pulling on it and withdrawing it from the surface. We see that if you really put the system into tension, the fluid gets sucked back in. So there starts to be less and less of a phase-separated fluid if you're actually sort of pulling on the surface. In the case of the spheres, which I think is what you particularly wanted to ask about in the I guess, is in these cases, well, in this case, I guess, or here, we're allowing the, and please interrupt me if I'm either like sort of on the wrong tangent or if you want to ask, sort of further questions. In the case of the spheres, we always see this foot, which indicates that there's a phase separated fluid. Even on the really stiff ones, that was hard to see from my pictures. There's always a little bit of a fluid region. It seems to be a little bit large or a little bit more pronounced in the kind of intermediate stiffnesses. And one of the ways, actually, the curvature, which I show you here, is also another sort of strong indicator of what's happening in that fluid contact regime, where this is a positive curvature. If you like to think about things in terms of the sort of Laplace pressure and wetting and curvature, a positive curvature means it would, for a pure liquid, would mean a positive back pressure. In this case, there's a solid under here that can sustain a stress. But in the liquid region, which is approximately here, it's probably not quite. This probably isn't quite as sharp as we've extrapolated it. And we always see a negative curvature. So this is showing us that sort of this is the liquid foot region and that it's under a tensile pressure. So I guess that tells us a little bit about what's happening there. But I do think it's always there. So I'm going to try to sort of go back to, yeah, so I'm now looking at I guess you can see what I'm looking at. So yeah, so we do think that there is always a fluid there, at least in these guys. I think probably if you pulled on them, you might start to pull that back in, although you may leave some behind. I was sort of inspired by some of David's experiments. Maybe we should see if we can leave footprints, but that's a separate issue. I don't know if that, Andrea, I think that touched on some of the things you had asked about, or if that was who was asking the question, I think.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. Thank you. And I think that my interest in the liquid in particular was regarding, I fully understand that as you deform something elastically, the material will have to be displaced in some direction. Since it cannot be displaced up, it will ooze out. So I could definitely imagine that there would be these feet at the bottom. I wasn't quite clear how the liquid would adapt to that, because I did think that the liquid here seems to have a good contact and affinity with the surface, since you have these, as you mentioned, very nice slopes. And so, yeah, I guess overall, I was a bit confused as to when you use capillary contact, do you consider capillary contact of the phase or the uncross-linked polymer in which your liquid is, and consider the whole contact area, or do you just consider the sphere? And so, yeah, that's where I got a little bit lost. But I think you answered my questions with what you've developed here. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to touch on that last bit. I mean, there may be differences in surface energies between the fluids and the sort of cross-linked parts. But for at least at the moment, for the to try to make the more complicated theory not even more complicated, we're taking the whole contact area for those calculations.
Which I think is sensible. I mean, who am I to speak? But it's
what
definitely
I
would have thought.
I think it's sensible also, but I still worry about it, because it's, I guess it's our job to worry about these details. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you.
Speaking of making it more complicated, there's a question in the chat that I'm going to read out. Freddie, thanks you for a great talk. And then he asked whether you haven't forgotten an energy term. And there's masses of the spheres that might play a role. So the question is whether the masses of the sphere play a role in the energy balance and the observed deformations.
Oh, that's a terrific question, but they're very small. So I guess you're sort of worried about, I guess the reason, sort of maybe a gravity term. Yeah, no, they're actually these are very, very, I mean, sort of small. So the weight of these, oh gosh, I'd have to work it out again. But and I should just memorize this off the top of my head, but they're so light, actually, it doesn't much matter. And actually, these are actually, the imaging is done on the side. So you're actually looking, gravity is into the, so first of all, gravity shouldn't matter because they're so small and lightweight. But second of all, gravity also really shouldn't matter because gravity is into the picture, I guess, into the board. So if you're worried about something other than gravity, I'm not sure what that would be actually, but if it's like an MC squared term, I think is also probably not relevant. So, but
No, but I think the question was on the potential importance of gravitational potential energy. That's how I understand it. Yeah, that's what Freddie's saying. He says your answer makes perfect sense. But I think that was the question. And I guess in principle, if you had a very dense sphere, that would indeed add an additional energy term to your.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And even in my my sort of my favorite picture of a rose, by which I really mean one of my favorite pictures of dewdrops. If you really look at some of these things are not perfectly spheres because they're larger than the capillary length of water, which is about 3 millimeters. That one I know off the top of my head because we use it all the time for the leaking dripping experiments when we want to make sure that the hole is smaller than the capillary length. But I guess so PDMS has a surface tension about 20 millinewtons per meter, so that's 3.5 times less than water. So that its capillary length should be then about 3.5 times less, so it would be just under a millimeter. And these are sort of tens of micron scale particles, 100 microns at the most. So yeah, so there's gravity shouldn't matter for these guys.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Keep the questions coming. I have a question for you, Kate.
Yeah, please.
You mentioned this 18-degree limit.
Yeah.
And then you said basically we're looking at a wetting limit. So that would suggest that independent of the softness of the sphere, if you would start to manipulate the surface energy of your glass substrate, you should be able to cut off that evolution of that curve early.
Yes, and you can. And we have. So we haven't totally finished analyzing those yet. And actually where that wetting limit comes from is also actually a super interesting question. And I took it out of this talk because I didn't quite have enough time to say anything about it. But we have actually done the experiment of doing a salinization of the, you can't see me, I keep gesturing, a salinization of the of the surface, and to modify the surface energy to be less wetting to the silicone, and indeed it cuts it off earlier.
Yeah, because that's I guess where I don't quite follow, because it's, so you showed the congruence between the theory of Suarez, was that the name? I forgot what the name was.
Yeah,
and your theory, and they looked difficult to distinguish on the scale of the variation in the experiment. The shape is though very different, right? So I guess coming back to Andrea's question, if you had a hypothetically very soft solid that had no liquid, then the shape would conform to the prediction of the other theory, I guess, but that pattern would be the same. Now, the contact angle, though, is it then determined by the surface tension of the liquid in the solid or by the surface tension of the solid?
Yeah. So it can't be so let me restore some of these things that I didn't actually hang on. Yeah. So here's the sort of so exactly what you're asking is like, what's setting that capillary limit? And so what's because actually the uncross-linked fluid is totally wetting on this surface. So it's not cut off by that, but it's, indeed, it should be totally wetting. And you see that really at the edges of the spheres as well, that they seem to make, I think Andrea pointed this out, they seem to make a really nice, smooth, exactly. Thank you for making the gesture for me that I am making. I think when I stop sharing, my camera will come on, but and so there's this. And so basically that's suggesting, there's a couple of possibilities. So, and indeed, if you take the theories and you just plug in, sort of naively plug in the fluid surface tension, you get the wrong prediction. I mean, you go to 0 because it should be totally wetting. And what I did before to just sort of start to understand the data is I said, well, we observe a capillary wetting limit. And so that's telling us what the sort of ratio of the adhesion energy to the surface tension is. And let's just use that empirical value for the moment. But if you don't do that and you just sort of try to say, well, what should this be? It's hard to know. And the other thing we can also do is actually look at these contact angles. So to sort of say, well, is somehow when we mix up the PDMS, does the liquid change? Is it different somehow? And so in order to look at that, what I did is I looked at both the macroscopic contact angle. So that's like, if I extrapolate this R1, what angle does it make, as well as the theta here. And basically the liquid part is still doing exactly what it was doing. I mean, it's noisy because you're measuring something very small here, but it's 0 as well as we could measure it. While this is just following basically what a spherical cap of roughly constant volume, it's not quite constant volume, that's why it's off, from the line, would do. And so really basically we have two options. And so either you can just say, well, for mysteriously, the surface tension is just 2.5 times bigger, and you plug that in, and that's actually what I did in the earlier parts of the talk to sort of make it match the capillary limit. Or, and this is something that is, I think, sort of currently a matter of, very much a matter of discussion in the community about whether or not a solid gel surface tension should change with deformation. This the sort of so-called Shuttleworth effect, if you're familiar with that. But basically, if you say that the surface tension is not just the liquid surface tension sort of plus something that is strain dependent, and that's something that's been understood and just accepted in sort of metals and more traditional engineering materials for decades. But the experiments there are very difficult because you can't deform a metal very far elastically before it yields. But in more recent experiments by myself and Qin Xu in particular, who I worked with quite a lot, we've looked at, and some others started to look at, can the surface tension be strain dependent? And if so, then maybe you do something really naive and just say it's linearly dependent with the area. And this is like a 200% areal strain. You've doubled the surface area by the time you're over here. And then also basically, if you kind of just put that in, you can get something that goes through the data pretty well as well. So we're sort of looking into this. And I guess at this point, all I feel really confident saying is that the results are consistent with the idea of it being a strain-dependent surface, having a strain-dependent surface tension. And I think that's actually more plausible than just it randomly being a higher number. but because there is such a shallow energetic minimum, it's not yet clear that we could use this to measure, for example, this strain dependence. So anyway, I for the sake of finishing in 45 minutes, I had taken these slides out, but I left them there just in case someone asked the question. Thank you for asking it.
I mean, I guess it's because you had this nice conceptual idea of you go from basically full non-wetting, and then you would expect the other limit to be the full wetting, but somehow it wasn't there, right? It was this
right.
18 degrees, which is not a number that you have physical intuition for, basically, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. And I mean, and then you could also make arguments that there is some physical limit that the polymers can't stretch infinitely far, and so we're sort of trying to compare what that might think. But at the same time, the softer you go, the less cross-linking you. First of all, the less cross-linking you have in the first place. So there's the elastic term should really drop out, and any kind of even kind of stretching term. And then the other thing is that the fact that we hit constant for this sort of whole range suggests that something is settling out, I guess, across this last decade of data. So we're still trying to tease that apart, and it's a really, really interesting question.
I'm still going to give people a couple of minutes to think whether they have more questions, because I certainly have some more for you. Okay. So you said that people have asked you about the soft on rigid versus rigid on soft, right?
Yeah.
Now the natural next step is then soft on very soft, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So what happens then?
Yeah, well, so that sort of gets back to this, this question, I guess. I guess, I mean, so you could imagine doing that as spheres on each other, which is sort of starting to look at what's happening here. And there we have some really cool preliminary data, sort of if you do a confocal stack and you look at this between spheres of approximately the same size, you really get flat facets. When one is bigger than the other, it sort of swallows it a bit, or you get curved interfaces, very similar to if you have foam bubbles in a foam of different sizes. And that's quite interesting. You also, of course, could imagine doing exactly the which we haven't done at all yet, of essentially doing the really classic experiment of whatever, I guess the sphere on, taking a sphere and putting it on a soft flat substrate, either with matched compliance or not matched compliance, and then what happens with somebody should be phase separating in fluid into the fluid, and you could look at probably who was doing it by putting dye in one or the other, and we haven't touched that at all yet, but it would be really fun to look at.
Great, lots of exciting experiments. Then there's no hands raised, so I suggest we at the very least stop the recording, so maybe that encourages some other members of the audience, if they still have a question, to ask it, and if not, okay, thanks very much for a very interesting, and there's my empty seat because Kate's my office. Oh,
right.
There's you.
Yeah. No, I figured I would appear so that the recording knows who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. And Kate's still around, so if people want to chat or ask further questions, please stay here. And if not, thanks very much again. Thanks again, Kemi and Jon. And
thank you all very much for listening, whether you're watching live or catching the end of the recording.
Great. Thanks very much. So feel free to stay if you have